Alright boys, so Ruler Moriarty is out, and he's a little bit of a mixed bag, because while he does have a lot of just really good and very powerful skills, his passive is pretty insane, he is an AoE art servant that kind of struggles to loop, and you guys will kind of get what I'm saying as we get into this servant, because he has a little bit of a problem with his NP gain being pretty low. And he's one of those looping servants that if you're going to loop with him, you're going to kind of have to brute force it, right? Because it's not like he can't do it, but it'll be a little difficult for him, right? And again, you guys will see what I mean as we start getting into his kit. So let's just not dilly-dally, and let's just go ahead and get right into this, starting off with Moriarty's hits. And you can already see it right there. His NP gain is quite low at only 0.37%, and his NP's hits are also quite low at only 4. Meaning two of the main things you really need to be a very good looping servant are already low on this servant. But you can see where they were trying to compensate for it by giving him a triple arts deck with 4 hits apiece. So they more or less want him to be able to like loop and spam his NP through his arts cards, because they gave him very, very strong arts cards and a triple arts deck. But his NP is kind of suffering from that because he doesn't really have that many hits on his NP. You know, look at somebody like Charlemagne, right? When Charlemagne came out, we were talking about how impressive that was, because 12 hits on an AoE NP is absolutely dummy insane, because it's going to make your ability to loop very easy, because you're getting all of those overkill hits, which are very crucial when you're talking about looping your NP. But Moriarty's kind of already down 2 strikes because his natural NP gain is a bit low and the hits on his NP are a bit low as well. So that's why I say you kind of have to brute force farming with this guy. It's not impossible, you can definitely do it, but it is going to be a little bit dicey, right? Sometimes you're going to be relying on some of the more powerful CEs that they released recently. Thankfully, you have things like the Like a Lady CE that starts you off with 50% and gives you NP gain, or you have the Hokusai Summer CE that also gives you 50% NP gain and an arts buff, right, from Summer 3. So if you weren't around on JP for Summer 3 and you missed out on that, maybe you were playing recently and you got the Vargas Like a Lady CE, those can definitely help Moriarty out and let him, you know, actually loop and everything. But aside from that, there's not a whole lot of other things that are super impressive with his hits. Although this is where I want to mention that his passive is pretty insane. The Panic Cut C+ gives him pretty much immunity to all of like the main things that the enemy is going to do that are going to annoy you. He's immune to charms, confusion, which confusion, if you guys don't know, is basically a type of skill seal. He's also just blatantly immune to skill seal as well, and he's immune to terror. Not immune to stun, but he is immune to terror, which basically means there's really not a lot the enemies can do to actually get this guy to immobilize him, right? It's actually really, really crazy how broken that one basically blanket debuff immunity skill is. It's pretty insane. But let's go ahead and move right into the skills for this guy, because all of his skills are pretty insane. Starting off with skill 1, he gives himself an evasion for 2 attacks for 3 turns, so kind of like the coup dodge skill, just a little bit weaker. He pierces evasion for 3 turns and reduces all enemies' arts resistance by 20% for 3 turns, but if they have the evil alignment, he further reduces it by another 20%, and this is on a 6-turn cooldown. Now, the interesting thing about this Moriarty is that on his NP, he actually has the ability to grant his enemies the evil alignment debuff, kind of like how the Archer Moriarty does it with one of his skills. So if you fire the NP and then fire this skill, you can actually further increase the amount of damage you're going to be doing by basically an additional 20%, because you're further reducing their arts resistance by 20%. Now, this is also why I feel like they didn't want him to be a looping servant, because they typically don't give these like reduction skills, like massively reducing defense or arts resistance, stuff like this, where you put something on the enemy to looping servants, right? Because typically you give these to boss killing servants, right? Because if you give it to a looping servant, it's kind of wasted because you can't use it on all 3 waves. And obviously looping servants, you want something like self buffs that you can use for 3 turns so you can get through all 3 of the waves, right? So you can carry those buffs with you. But this is like a pretty big like boss killing skill in and of itself. I mean, everything here is just really good for just closing out and just destroying a boss. You're keeping yourself alive with a very, very strong defensive skill. You're piercing evasion, so one of like the main ways that the bosses would try to keep themselves alive is null and void, And then you have 2 ways to just absolutely Tim Tam slam the enemy into the ground with your arts NP. Granted, you could still argue that like you could use this on say like a wave 3 of a farming node, but that's not going to be as effective unless that enemy is already inflicted with the evil alignment. So again, this is kind of why I'm thinking maybe they wanted him to just be like a boss killing servant, but then they were like, not really sure what they wanted to do here. But overall, it is a very, very strong first skill. If you move on to the second skill, it's literally just a bunch of generic good stuff. It is literally like probably one of the most generic good skills I've ever seen in the game, because it just buffs all of his cards by 30% for 3 turns and gives him 30% crit damage for 3 turns on a 6-turn cooldown. Like, literally just a bunch of really good generic good stuff. The one that you're going to care about the most, because he has a triple arts deck, is obviously the arts card buff, because it's going to be buffing his NP and pretty much the majority of his deck, as well as also buffing the NP gain of those arts cards. But getting buff to the quick cards and especially the buster cards could also be really, really nice as well, because let's say you get like crits on the buster card or something, that's still going to have a little bit of bite to it because he's getting the 30% buff to his buster card and a 30% crit buff. So it is just a pretty good skill to have. A little bit weird to have like this omni card buff on somebody that has a triple arch deck, because you're not seeing the buster and quick card that often. But at the same time, we're not going to complain about basically getting buffs to those skills as well, because like I was saying, if you get like crits on those cards, you know, it's really going to actually sting a little bit, because now you're actually buffing those with not only a card buff, but a crit buff as well. But there's not really a whole lot to say aside from that skill, so I mean, let's just move on to skill 3, where he gives himself a 50% battery, which is kind of why I'm saying he can brute force his way in farm, because a 50% battery is pretty dang good. But then he has a very, very interesting skill here. So you guys know how I was specifically just mentioning how he can do buster crits, right? And they'll have a little bit of bite to them. Well, he can choose to give himself star weight for his arts cards for a turn, or star weight to his buster cards for a turn. And that's why I was saying it's actually kind of important for the buster cards specifically to get buffed, because this guy can actually choose which one he wants to have star weight on. You can either increase the star weight of your arts cards if maybe you're trying to loop your NP a little bit easier, because arts crits are going to let you refund more NP, or if you need to do more damage, you can inflict more buster star weight to himself and get yourself a nice buster crit and just slam the enemy, because this skill also drops 20 stars with it as well. If you choose the buster card, it'll probably guaranteed all go to that, because the 20 stars will have increased weight on that buster card, and since there's only one of them, it's pretty much like in theory a guaranteed buster crit, if you think about it that way. Like if you just think about like Moriarty has all 5 of his cards out ready, you drop this skill, because the buster card has the most weight, they'll probably all go over there, and there's only one of them, so you're pretty much guaranteed to get that one buster crit. If that's, you know, I know I'm explaining it, but like hopefully that makes sense. It's really, really strong. But then if you're only seeing like a few of your arts cards and you want to get those crits because you really need that NP gain, you can choose the arts star weight for that turn, and it's actually really, really strong. So overall, all of his skills are insanely good, but if we go over to his NP, extremely strong. As you guys can see right there, he does inflict the evil alignment to all enemies for 3 turns, which is very, very strong because it ties into his first skill. It also is really nice because if you have anybody like, let's say, Lancer Vlad, right, whose NP has a special damage mod against evil people, you can pretty much fulfill that special damage mod for those servants by making the enemies and forcing them to meet those requirements by making them evil, right? So any servant that needs an evil alignment to do, you know, more damage or to inflict their debuffs or something along those lines, Ruler Moriarty can pretty much force those interactions, which is very, very strong and opens up a lot of team diversity and a lot of just different team comps that it opens itself up into. So that's very, very cool. He also seals all of their skills for 1 turn, which is very strong because that can prevent the enemy from buffing themselves, popping defensive buffs, popping batteries, all those random things that the enemies can do that are really annoying. He can pretty much put a stop to that for 1 turn. And because he is an art servant, you could try to loop this against bosses to pretty much chain keep their skills sealed, which is very, very strong. He gives himself a little bit of extra damage by giving himself an NP damage buff for 1 turn that procs first, obviously, and that goes from 20 to 40% depending on overcharge. So that makes sure that he actually is doing a little bit more damage, in which case, you know, Moriarty's damage without his special damage mod is not bad. It's pretty good damage for an AoE servant, actually, which I'm glad they did because he is a ruler, and because he's a ruler, He's not really going to be super effective against so many people, right? Because rulers are really only effective against moon cancers and berserkers. So there's not going to be a lot of times that you're going to break him out and get super effective damage. Most of the time, if you're using him, he's going to be neutral against people. So I'm glad they gave him like naturally really hard hitting damage, right? And the other thing to mention is that if you are using him against like people that he's quote-unquote super effective against, which is pretty much predominantly going to be berserkers in farming nodes, berserkers are the hardest enemies to farm against because they actually give you the least amount of NP gain back. So if you're using him against those, just keep that in mind that he already has very naturally low NP gain, and berserkers give him the least amount of NP gain back. But finally, the last thing on his NP is that he has a big special damage mod against enemies that are good aligned, which is really, really strong. And overall, just makes him a very, very strong servant. Little disappointed that he has very, very low NP gain. If his NP gain was a little bit higher or the hits on his NP were a little bit higher, he would be a more standout servant, but he is still exceptionally good. Like, is he worth the role? Most definitely. He is a very, very strong servant. He will definitely bring a lot of power to your box. It's just a little gripe that I have that I'm like, why do they, it's like just a little bit of a shaft that they put in there. Like, not a huge shaft, but just a little one that they put in there just to kind of be a little annoying. I'm like, why would you guys do that? But overall, the man is exceptionally powerful. He is just doing a lot of very good things, and he brings a lot to team comps as well. The fact that he can lower the enemy's arts resistance means, like, let's say you're fighting a boss or something, that means any other servant that you're using around him that's also a DPS is getting more damage by him lowering their arts resistance. And if there is someone in your team comp that needs the enemy to be evil aligned, Moriarty can force those interactions on his own NP. So like, all that stuff is very, very good. In terms of like boss killing and stuff, he's pretty self-sufficient in the way that he can keep himself alive with his first skill. He has a 50% battery to keep his own NP topped off. His skill cooldowns are all like pretty average at 6 apiece. You don't have to wait for like 10 turns for things to come off cooldown or anything crazy like that. So overall, just a very, very strong servant. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Make sure you leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel for that daily FGO content. And if you want more content, well, I stream every weekday over on my Twitch. Make sure you come out to those streams. There is exclusive videos for channel members if you click that join button. And if you want to support the channel for absolutely free, more than you already have just from watching this video, you can download LD Emulator in the description down below. It is that first link down there. And I just recently discovered that you can play FGO at 120 frames per second, which I've been doing on my Twitch. So it makes the game look really clean. So if you want to do that for FGO, do that. And it is 100% safe, as I do use LD Emulator for both of my main accounts when I stream and everything. So it is safe to use. You're not going to get banned or anything, right? But with all that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. You guys have yourselves a nice day. Peace. Late, guys.